Thank you, Professor Yu, for that kind introduction. It's very nice to be here again. I think the last time I was here was when Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so this time around, you've got another illustrious graduate of the Academy. He's running for president. So I don't know if there's a correlation, certainly not causation. So I've had the pleasure of visiting the Academy before, and so I know that what surprised the author of an article in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday, I'm not surprised. He was surprised, he said, James Traub, to come to the Naval Academy and find that a lot of the faculty were not balding men in frumpy brown coats. I knew that. Because all the balding men in frumpy brown coats are up at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, they dress pretty snappily. Actually, with the exception of present company here. But anyway, before so I was asked today to give a talk on how China manages Taiwan and why this matters to the U.S. Navy. But before I address the question head-on, first I think we need to understand where Taiwan fits in Chinese foreign policy writ large. To do this, we need to look at what drives Chinese foreign policy. Since the 1990s, Beijing has embarked on an unprecedented initiative to expand its economic activities and diplomatic reach around the world. China has well and truly gone global. People's Republic of China has never been so engaged and so active in world affairs as it is today. Chinese companies invest and conduct trade with virtually every country in the world. Contrast this to the policy of autarky in Mao's day, which kept China closed off from the global economic system. And when we look at the diplomatic side of things, whereas in the era of Mao Zedong, senior Chinese leaders rarely ventured beyond the borders of their own country, in the era of Deng Xiaoping, top leaders made limited forays abroad. But today's leaders of China are literally globe-trotting emissaries who regularly visit countries in every corner of the world. Take 2006, for example, and Africa, continent of Africa. The Chinese president, premier, and foreign minister made trips to Africa. In all, they visited 16 countries. According to a specialist in South Africa, he said it was unprecedented. He said, I can't think of any other head of state, even the president of my own country, the Republic of South Africa, who has visited as many African countries as that. And this is true for other parts of the world, including more close in our hemisphere, in Latin America. China's leaders have made visits unprecedented in their history. But there's a paradox here. Many specialists in Chinese foreign policy and specialists on China contend that Beijing's #1 priority is domestic stability. China's leaders are most concerned with internal security. That's the argument made. If this is true, and I personally agree with that, I think it is true, why has Beijing embarked on this extensive outreach abroad if its foremost preoccupation is with matters at home? The answer, I think, is that in the post-Cold War era, China's leaders have realized that internal stability in China is increasingly vulnerable to international events, and China's domestic affairs and foreign policies are greatly impacted by the actions of other countries, notably the United States. Moreover, growing numbers of Chinese people are being exposed to and obsessed by the global scene, including the way China was treated by other countries and its standing in the world. Globalization has therefore altered the way China's leaders think about foreign and domestic policy. What is required, Beijing's leaders concluded, was a more proactive and global foreign policy. In short, for China, thinking locally demands acting globally. Thinking locally demands acting globally. They've got the globalization thing. They recognize this is a new world, and China is bound up in it. In the late 1990s, a series of events brought this home to China's leaders. They realized they could be affected by these events that happened outside of China, outside of their control, such as the Asian financial crisis. Now we're talking about a different financial crisis that's on everyone's minds, but back in 1997, 1998, there was an East Asian financial crisis, which affected China. In 1999, in the space of a period of about 4 or 5 months, a number of events, dramatic events, impacted China. One of them was China's failure to get Clinton administration approval to join the World Trade Organization. Of course, they eventually joined 2 years later, but this was a huge blow to China's leaders, who had staked their reputation on getting approval from President Clinton and for China to join that organization. Also, in 1999, it was a surprise, a real surprise, in the form of a demonstration right outside the leadership compound, China's leadership compound at Zhongnanhai, in the center of Beijing, by a bunch of middle-aged, mainly middle-aged people, and a lot of middle-aged women, who sat down in silent protest, tens of thousands of them. This is a Falun Gong demonstration. If you're all familiar with Falun Gong, it's a movement that's actually banned in China now. It's outlawed. But the reason for this is because this shocked China's leaders. They couldn't believe that without any warning, people showed up to protest. And as I said, if you think that, if you agree as I do that China's leaders' number one priority is domestic stability, and you don't know about a protest that happens right on your doorstep, it's very, very frightening. Another thing that happened in 1999 was the accidental bombing of China's embassy in Belgrade. Somebody got the coordinates wrong, and the result was tragedy and outrage in China, mass protests and anger, real anger, directed at the United States in particular, but other members of NATO as well. I don't know if you've seen footage of that or seen what our embassy in Beijing looked like after Chinese demonstrators. It looked like a burned-out shell from the outside. But again, an event that happened halfway around the world, having a direct impact on China. So I think that it's on the point. So the latest Chinese defense white paper, published in December of 2006, says, and I quote, "Never before has China been so closely bound up with the rest of the world as it is today." So what are the drivers of Chinese diplomacy? I think the most important drivers of Beijing's diplomacy can be summed up in 2 words: security and status. What do these translate into? They translate into, you won't be too surprised to hear me say this given what I've just said. Security and status translate into ensuring domestic stability, maintaining good relations with Washington, and promoting China's international standing. As I said, their foremost priority is maintaining domestic stability. A number of scholars looking at Chinese foreign policy have argued that in this era, in the first decade of the 21st century, China has entered a new period of confidence and maturity in its foreign policy. I'd say that's partly true. That confidence and maturity is manifest in the way China is comfortable using the instruments of diplomacy: multilateral, bilateral, public diplomacy. We see things like the Confucius Institutes around the world. China is very comfortable dealing with that. attending international summits, global summits. Chinese leaders, they're very adept at doing that. But I think below the surface, China's leaders remain fundamentally insecure. And that is because they're mostly concerned with domestic, as I said, domestic stability. What, in their view, ensures continued domestic stability? I think it relies in part on firm political control, continue with that, what we would call repression. But it also relies heavily on sustained economic growth. Both of these dimensions are viewed as being closely intertwined with the international environment. And above all, internal stability assumes peace in China's immediate neighborhood, especially on the country's periphery. But the continued economic growth that China has enjoyed over the last several decades also demands that Beijing operate further afield to secure natural resources and develop markets. Beijing is particularly concerned with energy security, especially petroleum. Another of China's priorities is managing its relations with the United States. China views Washington as both a threat and an opportunity. But maintaining good relations with the sole superpower is seen as key to continued Communist Party rule, economic prosperity, and overall national security. Geopolitically, economically, and militarily, the United States looms large for China. Therefore, it should be no surprise that the most important overseas posting for a Chinese diplomat is ambassador to Washington. Moreover, in recent years, the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., has been, at the conclusion of his tour, been promoted to foreign minister of China. Keeping on good terms with Washington doesn't mean that Beijing always seeks to accommodate, agree, or acquiesce to U.S. Policy desires. On the contrary, China works to counter or at least contain U.S. influence in Asia and the world. Simultaneously, China works to expand its influence, especially in its Asian neighborhood. Nevertheless, China does try to conduct its activities in a manner that does not unnecessarily antagonize the United States. Another important foreign policy priority is enhancing its own international standing and status. As a positive high profile for China on the international stage is extremely desirable for China's leaders. As your own professor sitting over here who's written an excellent book on the subject of China's status, Professor Deng. Yeah. So it's a great book, and I just got him to autograph my copy, by the way.
Thanks for that.
But he notes in his book, quote, that Chinese are intensely sensitive to their nation's international status, treating it as if it were the overriding foreign policy objective, unquote. So it's important for China's leaders to be seen as a major global player in and of itself. And part of this status consciousness is related to the critical dimension of legitimacy, the justification for Communist Party rule. Chinese people are more than ever acutely aware and acutely conscious of and sensitive to their country's treatment and status in the world. To the extent that Beijing, i.e. China's leaders, are seen as being able to raise the status of their country, the legitimacy of the Communist Party in the eyes of the Chinese people increases. To the extent that Beijing is seen as unable to deliver on it, this contributes to this frustration and resentment Chinese people feel towards their own government. In short, China must look stronger and more respected abroad for its communist leaders to feel more secure at home. Okay, I'm finally getting to Taiwan. Taiwan figures prominently in each of these priorities and beyond. The island figures in domestic stability because Beijing believes that appearing soft on Taiwan will arouse the ire of the Chinese people. Moreover, if Taiwan takes the path towards independence and the communist regime is not seen to do an adequate job of thwarting the move, the Communist Party will endure the full wrath of the masses, widespread unrest, or worse. Taiwan also figures prominently in China's relationship with the United States because Beijing believes that Washington is engaged in sabotaging Chinese efforts at cross-strait unification, or at least manipulating the situation to its advantage. Hence, without cooperation or assistance from Washington, resolving the Taiwan issue is, in Beijing's view, much more difficult, if not impossible. Lastly, Taiwan figures in the enhancement of China's stature internationally because the island is considered a constant thorn in its side. In Beijing's thinking, by competing with China for diplomatic recognition of small states in the Third World and pressing for entry in organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization, subjects China to constant embarrassment. In short, the issue of Taiwan is central to Chinese foreign policy. So I've made the case that China's twin quests for security and status are driving Chinese foreign policy. How Beijing manages the Taiwan issue will largely be determined by these drivers. Okay. As I think many of you know, Taiwan has for a century, or half a century I should say, or more, been a key issue for China and for U.S.-China relations. Although recently it has not been a very contentious one. Relations between Beijing and Taipei seem to be good right now. Indeed, we've witnessed a dramatic improvement in cross-strait relations since the election of President Ma Ying-jeou 6 months ago on Taiwan. I was in China in May when the chairman of the Kuomintang, the ruling party on Taiwan, was visiting Beijing. And he met with Hu Jintao, the president of China, in the Great Hall of the People. To my amazement, the event was carried live on Chinese Central Television. Carried live, including all the, with mics there. That's very unusual for Chinese TV to cover events like that live. I also saw extended clips of a press conference with Ma Ying-jeou on CCTV. I asked Chinese friends of mine if this was the first time that a Taiwan president had been given airtime on mainland television, and they said it was. I don't know how many of you watch the I'm sure a lot of you watch the Olympics. I don't know how many of you watch the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. When I pose the question, which group of athletes marching into the opening ceremony, marching into the stadium, got the biggest cheer from the crowd? Now it's, I didn't gauge it with a meter to see loudness of the crowd, but up there, if not the largest, the delegation that got the largest cheer, I think, was a group of Taiwan athletes, and I think that reflects on the emotional nationalism that Chinese people feel towards the island of Taiwan being a part of China, and also the positive feelings that most people in China have towards Taiwan at this point in time. So there's been a remarkable upturn in cross-strait relations. But before you get carried away with a warm, fuzzy feeling about the situation in the Taiwan Strait, you need to think back on all the ups and downs we've seen in the relationship and how the United States has been involved in the what I call the serial crises in the Taiwan Strait. It's easy to forget that in this era of goodwill right now. And we cannot simply assume that the current honeymoon between Taipei and Beijing will continue. Moreover, the Taiwan Strait still remains the most likely scenario for a military confrontation or conflict between China and the United States. Certainly Beijing hopes that the good atmosphere and positive trends will continue, and so does Taipei. So won't China-Taiwan relations take care of themselves? They certainly might, but it's dangerous to assume this will be so. In a Taiwan contingency, the U.S. military will almost certainly be involved. I should be more specific. My colleagues at the Army War College used to say to me, "Why are you so focused on Taiwan? Even if there's a war, it's not going to be an Army war. It's going to be an Air Force war and a Navy war." Well, I tried to make the point that the Army would be involved one way or another. Even if after the hard-fought victory of the Navy, we'd have to send in a token force to, Army force to sit on Taiwan, keep it, remind the Chinese that we mean business. But so seriously, how China manages this issue of Taiwan matters greatly to the U.S. Navy. Of course, China is not the only actor here. Taiwan is not I don't mean to suggest that Taiwan is a passive player. Moreover, the United States is a player, even if we'd rather not be. But China is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So I think you'll understand why I'm focused on that aspect of it. That's important to note that Beijing has a significant stake in maintaining an environment of peace and development in the Asia-Pacific region. And those are the terms that Chinese leaders like to use. Peace and development are the key trends in the region and in the world. It doesn't want a war with Taiwan. And it wants to maintain good relations, as I've already mentioned, with the United States. A conflict would not only lead to deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China, but it will also be bad for business. And China's business is business. I mean, it's very, very much, as I've already said, wants to keep that economic boom going, and a war would not help that. If one thing that would be immediately affected in any conflict would be the economic interactions across the Taiwan Strait. And there's a heck of a lot of trade. And at least, probably estimates, at least 1 million Taiwanese live on the mainland quasi-permanently. So, a war in the Strait would dramatically affect China's economy without a doubt. But remember what I said. Beijing also cares about status. And Taiwan is linked to China's status, as Professor Deng reminds us in his book. He says that communist elites, quote, have made Taiwan's formal independence a more dangerous casus belli than it has been in the past. So, given all this, how should we look at future scenarios in the Taiwan Strait? Well, I've got a little handout here. I have to start on this side too. Now, I confess I'm a recovering political scientist. And I got a PhD in political science.
That's not a bad thing, sir.
Well, it can be good, it can be bad. If you let theory get in the way of analysis, it can be bad.
Well, you
but
can
I would,
overpower.
right? Yeah.
I think I'm on the right.
I'm in the 12-step program. But seriously, what theory can do, if used correctly, can be very helpful in organizing our thoughts, in framing our analysis. Even simple theory can be helpful. And one of my colleagues at Texas A&M believes that every problem, no matter how complex it is, can be reduced to a 2-by-2 matrix. Right? Now, I don't tend to go that way, but I do think that perhaps in this case, a 2-by-2 matrix might be useful. And hence, you have one in your hands right now, I think. And I don't have one to look at, but I don't think I need it. I would suggest that there are how China manages Taiwan, there are two key variables. Of course, there are other variables we can think of too, but I think perhaps the two key ones are, whether or not the issue is resolved, and whether or not military force is used in attempting that resolution. So whether or not force is used, and whether the issue is resolved or not. Now, what do I mean by resolution? What I mean by resolution is the solution of the Taiwan issue that is acceptable to Beijing. Now, an implicit assumption in this is that de jure independence for Taiwan is not acceptable to Beijing. Okay, so each of those four cells that you've got in front of you represents a distinct future scenario. Cell A represents a scenario in which there is no military conflict and no political resolution. Cell B represents a scenario in which there is no conflict, but the Taiwan issue is resolved. Cell C represents a scenario in which there is a military conflict, but the Taiwan issue is not resolved. Cell D represents a scenario in which there is a conflict and resolution of the Taiwan issue. Okay, I'm going to make the point that I think the most likely scenarios are A or B at the top, so no conflict scenarios. But that doesn't mean we can ignore the conflict scenarios, because guess what? The people in this room, you all may be having to deal with a similar situation. Because the last time I gave a lecture here in one of Professor Deng's classes, I said, you know, don't worry about the PLA for at least another 20 years. And right at the end of the presentation, a midshipman came up to me and said, sir, that was a very interesting presentation, but in 20 years, I might be commanding a ship in the Western Pacific, and I might have to deal with that PLA Navy that took 20 years to get where it is and be a peer competitor of us. So I take those words very seriously. China's Navy and China's military is developing. It's not close to where we are today, but it's certainly moving in that direction. So I'm going to spend most of the next few minutes, my concluding minutes, talking about those conflict scenarios. But what about that first cell? Well, the status quo persists. That doesn't mean time stands still. It doesn't mean nothing changes. But essentially, it's a continuation of what we've seen for the last few decades. No war, but no resolution. That's certainly possible and quite likely. Perhaps even more likely is the scenario in cell B. That is, that positive trends continue. And if you think about what I was talking about a few minutes ago, positive trends, we've seen them over the last 6 months or so. And there's every indication that that will continue for at least a while. But Taiwan is a democracy, right? And so there could be a change of government. And remember, the group that the China's leaders like to blame was the group then, the party then in power, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, which could at some point be returned to power. And plus, as we know, when you're a democracy, you have to be responsive to the needs of the people. Otherwise, you're out of office. So Taiwan's leaders, however more conciliatory they are to the mainland, still have to play the domestic political game. You know, they're playing two-level games. Again, going back to the usefulness sometimes of IR theory. Right? Helps you understand how what is happening. So these actually may sound pretty straightforward, and they are, except somebody has to be constantly monitoring the situation, right, to see where the trends are going. And there may be one of you sitting in a windowless room at Fort Smith or somewhere else, Camp Smith, sorry, in Hawaii or somewhere else, or sitting in a vessel somewhere in the world on the Pacific, trying to monitor what the Chinese are doing and whether which way the trends are going, whether a military exercise is actually a military exercise or whether it's something else. So the status quo and positive trends, those scenarios, are not quite as straightforward as they might appear. So let's go to talk a little bit to the conflict scenarios. Conflict without resolution. So as I've said, resolution is a outcome, excuse me, that is acceptable to China's leaders. And my assumption, which is debatable, is that for China to go to war over Taiwan and not to win, one thing has to happen. The U.S. military has to be there. We can debate this. Taiwan may be able to defend all by itself, but I think most people would agree that to make sure that China is not successful in any military effort to seize, control Taiwan, is the U.S. Navy and Air Force, and maybe we'll send some Army guys over just to make it look good, need to be there. But that would be a major shock, I think. Because if you have now, again, I've built in some assumptions, but it's possible. I mean, I think there would be some kind of escalation control if there was a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait between the U.S. and China. But that's a debatable assumption, because I think the Chinese and the U.S. would realize we don't want to go all the way to nuclear war. We don't want to go to all-out war. But maybe that's, I mean, as I said, that's a debatable assumption. But I think at some point, as I said, if the U.S. military intervenes, the Chinese effort to seize Taiwan will be unsuccessful, and there will be some kind of ceasefire or some kind of and lull in the fighting, because both parties would be, especially the Chinese side, would probably be exhausted. They'd have spent their assets would be decimated, and they need to regroup. So at some point, but maybe not. Maybe the escalation would go. But let me tell you this. I think that in this situation, it would never be over. What I mean by that is, we may have defeated China on the battlefield, on battle space, but Taiwan is such an important issue that they would never give up their claims on Taiwan, and so this would never be over. And as a result, the reason I call this a major shock or a big shock is this would probably lead to a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. So we hope we don't have to go there, and I'm cautiously optimistic. But I think we need to think some of these things through, and I encourage, when I'm talking to my Chinese counterparts, the same thing. So that would be that's a very sobering scenario. Even though we win, right? We win, but what are the consequences? They would be serious and significant. If you look at that last cell D, conflict with resolution. In this scenario, China wins. Now we can debate how the specifics of that scenario, variations of that scenario, but here some of the assumptions I make are that the U.S. is not involved. The U.S. forces aren't involved. Now, how could that happen, you say? Well, there's the tyranny of distance. You've heard of that. And it's particularly plays a role in a Taiwan scenario. But so one possibility is that China strikes so quickly that it's all over before the cavalry gets there, or the Navy. I can't resist my land power references, but you get the point. It's all over before we really know what's happening. Another possibility is Taiwan's leaders do something stupid. And the White House says, you dug your own grave, good luck, don't count on us. That could happen. That could happen. Because a lot of this depends on how the situation begins. What circumstances lead to this, and who looks like the bad guy, who looks like the good guy. But probably more likely, in any of these situations, it'll be the fog of war will literally be there. And it'll be very confusing and hard to figure out. All right, I don't want to spoil anyone's weekend, so I'll stop. I'll wrap it up soon. But these scenarios also have implications for the Chinese military and Chinese military modernization. And it's actually, I started thinking about this and came up with this matrix in preparation for a conference I'm going to go to at the Army War College on the Chinese military this weekend. I'm trying to think about military missions beyond Taiwan for the PLA. And not necessarily thinking that beyond meaning Taiwan solved, but military missions other than Taiwan. But again, there are different, I think we need to think about different scenarios to make it a little more concrete when we're dealing with this. So how China manages Taiwan will not only affect the future trajectory of China, but it'll affect the future trajectory of U.S.-China relations. And we can be hopeful that the current positive trends will continue, and we can hope that the drivers of Chinese foreign policy, security and status, influence China's foreign relations and Taiwan policy in such a way that we never have to think seriously about, beyond the hypothetical, about a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for question and answer. So, floor is yours.
Yes, sir.
Sir, in your opinion, what is the state of U.S.-China military ties, and what kind of role does it play in the overall U.S.-China political climate?
Okay. Good question. The question was, how would I characterize the state of mill-mill relations between the U.S. and China? And so what was the...
And what kind of role does that play in the overall political relationship?
And what kind of role does that play in the overall relationship? Well, it's a really good question. I think I would characterize relationship, mill-mill relationship as pretty good right now. The problem is that it's probably the most politicized aspect of the relationship. So as soon as there's a problem in the relations, guess which takes the first hit? Their visits canceled, somebody's protests. For example, it was last year, there was, Chinese got bent out of shape, and I don't mean this lightly because it's serious business for China's leaders, but the president of the U.S. met with the Dalai Lama. Chinese don't like that because, of course, they consider Taiwan part of China, and anytime this kind of interaction happens, it implies that Tibet is an independent state or a separate state. So the Chinese got upset with that. They also got upset with our announced arms sales to Taiwan. So what was the result? They suspended mill-mill activities with a little asterisk where it suited them. I organized a conference last year in Washington, and we had PLA people coming, and I didn't know what. And finally, the person that we wanted to come didn't come, but they sent someone else instead. But that's just all I mean to do there is illustrate that this is. I think on both militaries think it's important for their own reasons, and I think there's a lot of respect and positive interaction on both sides. But it really becomes the first casualty in any tensions between the U.S. and China, which makes it difficult to maintain the continuity and the trajectory. But then, of course, there are other issues like like transparency. We talk a lot about transparency. We want the Chinese military to be more transparent. And the Chinese have actually recognized that that's an important dimension, but they're much more, they're not willing to go as far as we would like them to go. So there are these other issues of reciprocity, for example. You know, if we let them visit a certain kind of military establishment in the U.S. facility, we want to visit a comparable facility in China, and that doesn't always happen. So anyway, enough, but it was a very good question. I'll stop there. Any other? Yes, sir.
Sir, do you think other Asian countries such as Japan or South Korea can influence the China-Taiwanese relationship?
Other Asian countries?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the question was, do I think other Asian countries such as Japan can influence the Taiwan situation? Is that right? Well, you mentioned the one country that probably really gets China's goat on Taiwan. They really get especially upset with Japan because there are, of course, Japan. You all know your history, right? Because you have an excellent history faculty here. But remember which country used to have Taiwan as a colony? Yep. So, and there are a lot, and of course they also Japan also occupied Taiwan in the what we think of as the Second World War, but but before that. But so there was this extended occupation period of Japanese occupation on Taiwan, and for some reasons that I won't go into, most people on Taiwan actually have positive feelings towards Japan because Japan actually, its occupation was free of many of the atrocities and horror stories that accompanied Japan's occupation in many other countries, including mainland China. So the mainland China doesn't get this. They don't understand why do the Chinese or the Taiwanese like Japan so much. And remember, former President Lee Teng-hui was fluent in Japanese, and there's a fair amount of back and forth between Japan and Taiwan. And so from China's perspective, Japan's role in this is not a good one. It's not a healthy one. It's not a positive one. It's a suspicious one. So there are two countries that China identifies as being behind-the-scenes manipulators, if you like, of the Taiwan situation. It's the United States and Japan. So if I might piggyback on your question and say, when I was in China in June of this year, I went out, I met with a group of PLA at a leading think tank, and a Chinese general asked me, he said, what can the U.S., and it was a surprising question to me, and he said, what do you think the U.S. can do to improve the Taiwan situation? I looked at him and said, I think we should do nothing. Aren't things going pretty well right now? And of course, he brought up arms sales and things like that. But the perception here is that, as I said, we're involved in this. The Japanese are involved in this. And what they want to make sure is, China wants to make sure that Asian countries or Latin American countries, whoever they are, however small they are, they don't afford anything that approaches full diplomatic relations, ambassador-level relations, or anything that implies that Taiwan is an independent country. And so far, in Asia, I don't think there's any country in Asia that has full diplomatic, ambassador-level diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So that's a good thing. So I don't know. I think hopefully I've answered your question. But Japan is a hot-button issue on this Taiwan. Yes, sir.
So what are the implications of a balkanization of the mainland China, especially for the U.S. military, particularly ground forces?
Do you really want another land war in Asia, or a land conflict, a land presence in Asia? We've got one already. I think I'm fond of saying to people, and some of my colleagues are too, be careful what you wish for. You want a weak China, it might be more problematic than a strong China. You go back and look at the warlord era in Chinese history in the early part of the last century. It was a very complicated period, and there was a lot of warfare between rival, as the name suggests, between rival factions, groups who controlled militaries. Some of these wars were like World War I. I mean, trench warfare. It was very, very brutal and devastating. But so a divided China or a balkanized China is not something that we should look forward to or even encourage, I don't think. That's not to say we shouldn't stand up for the treatment of or mistreatment of ethnic minorities such as Tibetans or Uyghurs or other groups in China, because that's a fundamental American value, human rights and self-determination, those kinds that we feel very strongly about those things. But to think about China breaking apart is very worrying, and I think that it's probably the people who talk about those scenarios are overhyping it. I mean, it's certainly possible, but I think China's leaders today have shown that they're very, very adept at managing the problems within China. There are lots of problems within China. We can run down a long, long list, from pollution to corruption, you name it. But what China's leaders have been able to do is keep these issues, these problems localized, so that there are mass protests all over China. But guess what? They're localized, and they're through bribery, through strong-arm tactics. The local authorities manage to keep the lid on these and keep these separate groups from linking up. So, China certainly has a lot of problems, and China's leaders are very much aware of those problems, and they're doing everything they can, as I suggested earlier in my talk, to make sure that they are managed, controlled. And so I wouldn't see a balkanization of China in the immediate or midterm. Who can look beyond 5, 10 years? But it's a good, it's worth thinking about. But I don't think it's worth hoping, wishing for, or working for. Okay.
Why do you think it's generally assumed that the Taiwan-China physical revolution is through military conflict? Taiwan's the largest foreign direct investor in China. Why don't you think it will come to an economic resolution? China's economic power over Taiwan.
Why don't I think it will be resolved just through economics? Okay. So the question was, given the level of economic interaction, the fact that Taiwan's probably the largest maybe the largest foreign investor in China, why don't I think that sort of economics will take care of the whole thing in due course? And that's entirely possible. Positive trends to continue, but not to be a doomsayer. And I was looking, I did a long multi-year project on North Korea for the Army. And people kept saying to me, why are you so negative? Why do you always focus on negative stuff, worst case scenarios? I said, well, you hope they never happen, but you better be ready if they do. So we better be ready. I mean, I know there's a plan, right? We know there is a plan. There are war plans, op plans for the Taiwan Strait, and that's a good thing. And we hope they never come about. But if economic ties, interdependence, were meant that countries didn't go to war, then we wouldn't have any war in the world, right? And of course, we fortunately don't have any major interstate conflicts. It's a more messy scenario than that. But you think about World War I. It's a popular war to study for IR theorists, right? The economic interactions between countries at the time, let alone from the elites of different countries, they were all related. All the royal families of Europe, right? Did that stop them from going to war? No. So I think it's entirely possible that the economics may take care of the situation, especially if no one's in a hurry to resolve the Taiwan issue, either on either side of the strait. If China's economic development continues to grow, and when the issue might go away when the income levels on the mainland approximate those on Taiwan, right? Now that'll probably take a while, but that's certainly possible. Another possibility is that Taiwanese like to talk about, because they figure it's a long time in the future, and I think they're A, sincere about it, but B, they figure it won't happen for a while, so it gets them off the hook. They say, yeah, we'll talk about unification when China becomes a democracy, right? So, but economics, it is the economy, stupid, right? And in the presidential debates tonight, if it happens, that'll obviously be the hot topic. Questions? Have I take one over? Nobody? Okay. Yes, sir.
So if the DPP on Taiwan does make a drive for independence and there's a referendum that we can vote on, would China then be forced? Are there any other alternatives other than war for China?
If the DPP returns to power, is that your question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And they make a drive for independence.
Okay. Question was, if the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, returns to power on Taiwan and makes a push for independence, does that mean China will resort to war? I think if to qualify what that means, but I would say, with the qualification, I would say yes. If that means Taiwan formally declares its de jure independence from China, yes, China will feel like it has to do something. But people in Taiwan, even pro-independence people, are very smart, right? They know they don't want to cross, if they can avoid it, they don't want to trigger a Chinese attack. So what they've done, and this has driven the mainland crazy up until recently, was make incremental steps in that direction, and making constitutional revisions, passing different laws, abolishing certain bodies that were involved in cross-strait relations, and so this really got Beijing upset, and it made it very hard to know where the red line was. Where was that? And it was very frustrating for China's leaders to deal with the DPP in power because things were rather ambiguous, and so they resorted to what some of my friends in China call paper missiles. Warnings, laws passed. There was an anti-succession law warning Taiwan that justification for going to war would be if one of them would be if Taiwan just simply refused to negotiate, essentially refused to put off dealing with the interacting with the mainland. So they tried to adjust their tactics, they being China, because they realized that the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, which you may be familiar with, they recognized in some ways that was counterproductive. And it actually increased sent anger on Taiwan against the mainland. And of course, by the way, it sent 2 carrier battle groups close, and that really shocked China's leaders that we would do that. So I think they recognized that was counterproductive. But have they given up on a military resolution of the Taiwan Strait? No. That is the scenario for China's military. Does that mean they're itching for a fight, as I've suggested earlier? No. But are they prepared to take it to launch a military operation if they feel it's necessary? Yes, absolutely. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
So do you think the time, talk about after 50 or 20 years later, do you think this problem will be possible to solve? Personally, I'm from Taiwan, and I'm international here, and I think the time actually will be, that is probably unsolvable, because right now you talk about the people pro-nationalism, try to come back with Taiwan. Those are the people retreat the troop from mainland China to Taiwan about 1949. Same kind of group, or my generation, when I learned history, I learned about part of history in China. So I have some kind of background understanding about mainland China. But newer generation, probably 10 years younger than me, they don't learn China history anymore. So they have no emotional linkage between China. So 50 years later, those people are going to be the middle class of the Taiwan society. I don't think there's any possible way that they have any kind of agreement try to become Chinese, because majority of people right now think they are Taiwanese, not Chinese anymore. So I was wondering, is your opinion about the time factor? Is the time playing an opposite way to this equation, or is it in other direction? Okay.
So the question in a nutshell was, I think, is this problem unsolvable? If you, even in the long term, given trends on the island, education, and the way people identify themselves in Taiwan as increasingly Taiwanese. Well, actually, one clarification to what you just said. Actually, many people on Taiwan identify themselves in multiple ways. So people say, I'm Taiwanese and I am also Chinese. A lot of people think that. So the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It's like saying, I'm Polish American. I'm still American, right? But my ethnic background is Polish, or whatever it is. So those two aren't mutually exclusive. But it's an interesting question, because you're right. The trends on Taiwan in terms of education are towards more of a Taiwan identity. And people are proud on Taiwan, as you know. Taiwan's accomplished a tremendous amount. It's an economic success story. It's a amazing example of successful democratization. And yet you've got this problem, this 800-pound gorilla that's about 90 miles away. And you can try and be nice to it. You can feed it bananas. But it doesn't have. It has a cage in the sense that its reach across the water has made it more difficult. I mean, Hong Kong, for example. Hong Kong, where I was born and grew up, if China wanted to take over Hong Kong, all it took was a phone call, we used to say. Because there's no water, there's no 90-mile Taiwan Strait there. And that's, in fact, what happened. Margaret Thatcher, back in 1982, realized that, when Deng Xiaoping said, I want it back, there's nothing that London could do. But in the case of Taiwan, it is you do have that span of water, so it does help. But I suspect that over time, if no one's in a hurry, and no one does anything too crazy to get anyone upset, enrage people on either side of the strait, this issue could be resolved. Because there's a dynamic going on here. Just as Taiwan will continue to evolve, so will the mainland. So thinking on the mainland will evolve as people on the mainland China become more prosperous, as it becomes more of as it democratizes, and their thinking may change about this. I also tend to think that if China's leaders become more confident about China, about the situation on the mainland, domestic stability, and they can become more flexible on how they approach the Taiwan issue. Right? So as long as everybody says there's one China, you can be flexible on what it really means, and what unification could mean, some kind of confederation, some kind of commonwealth. I mean, you could have Taiwan could basically continue to do its own thing and still be, and China, and there could be some kind of general agreement that's reached somewhere down the road where everybody's happy, everybody does their own thing, but really there's no significant change in what happens on Taiwan. Now, there's one complicating dimension in all this that I won't address unless it comes up in a question, because it's a big it's a big one, and I don't want to touch on it right now. But it's entirely possible this thing could be resolved by itself, but we can't assume that to be the case. Any other questions? Anyone who hasn't had a question? You run out, you're probably...
This section is awfully quiet.
Yeah. Well, at least they're awake. This is good. Yes?
Sure. A lot of, with China's increased economic growth, with their increased exposure, with the Olympics, there was a lot of positives going into the China equation. Some people say, well, that will allow them to be more stable, allow them to get more confidence, and allow them to be more flexible, like you said, perhaps lead to some more democratization. Other people say it's the opposite effect, that will legitimize the Communist Party. It will give them a sense of, we actually belong, and now we can do what we've always done with more authority and force because we are now one of the top dogs. Do you fall on either side of the argument?
No, it's a very good point. That the comment was that isn't it possible that all the things many things I've been talking about, including the Olympics, will make China's leaders more confident that they are the legitimate rulers of China and they don't need to democratize. They've got a pretty good handle on all this. They've raised China's standing in the world. The economy is still booming, and most Chinese people are content enough that they don't need to make any changes. And that's entirely possible. In fact, a journalist has written a really thin but very good book. We were just talking about it beforehand, The China Fantasy. And in that he argues that American leaders have sold the U.S. American people a lie, basically, that a fantasy that China will democratize, that everything we're doing is encouraging China to democratize, right? But that's not a there's no basis to conclusively argue that, and he's right. He's right. But let me tell you, China has liberalized compared to what it was under Mao. I mean, under Mao Zedong, China, in my view, was a totalitarian system. Okay, and I won't go into all, don't get a political scientist started on totalitarianism. But today, certainly China is a repressive, dictatorial system. But there's a lot of freedom in China today. Personal freedom. People can travel abroad now. It's very easy to get a passport. People can travel within China. They're not wedded to their jobs like they were in the past. There's a lot more personal freedom. Now, as long as you don't get out in the street and say, "Da da Gong Tan Dang," down with the Communist Party, you're okay, right? And the cardinal sin is to organize, right? You can actually complain about your government. You can actually, voice those concerns. But if you organize, if you talk to one other person and form a party or some kind of group, guess what will happen to you? You won't last long. You won't last long. So you're absolutely right. That's a very legitimate point to raise, and I certainly don't claim to be able to look into the future. But just remember that China has loosened up. It has liberalized, and there are real elements, albeit limited, of democracy in China today.
Can you have more than one child?
There are circumstances in which you can do that, but it's still not. I think that's still basically the rule. Is that right?
That's
yeah,
right,
yeah. And in fact, it was interesting that when I brought my family for the first time to China this summer, and we took a lot of taxis around Beijing, and in the traffic and the smog, they hadn't cleaned it up for the Olympics yet. And I, chatting with a taxi driver, and he said, "Well, are those both your kids?" I said, "Yeah." And so it was, they're still on that one-child thing. And actually, one taxi driver said to me, "Yeah, I have 2 kids." I said, "How many kids do you have?" And he said, "Oh, I have 2." But he lived out in the countryside, and they were both girls. And in some case, if you have a girl as your first child, then sometimes you're allowed to try again for a boy, because everybody knows that what a male chauvinist society, China is unlike the United States, right? I know, I'm being facetious, but that's a good question.
We have a question. We have time for one question, and then Taiwan issue will be resolved.
Yes. Yeah.
briefly speak on how the Chinese government uses and manipulates the deeply entrenched nationalism in the country to fulfill its goal of the society?
Comment on how the Chinese government manipulates the
nationalism of the people.
Oh, the nationalism of the people to portray. Yeah. Well, so how does the government manipulate nationalism in China? Yeah, it's a dangerous game. It's a double-edged sword because everyone in China knows that it's not a democracy. And so what are the bases of legitimacy of the Communist Party? It's this economic, it's performance-based, I would argue. How good, what are the, and for the Chinese people, it's what have you done for me lately? Right? So as long as the economy keeps going, chugging along, people have their discontents, have their frustrations, but as long as they see their paychecks and prosperity continuing and a better future for their kids, or kid, I should say, right? Then they're relatively, they can put up with it. They can stomach that. Part of that, too, is, as we said, status, right? China's standing in the world. And that's all about nationalism. So here's where here's where the Taiwan issue comes in. And I would say, I'm not as articulate as Professor Deng in his writing, but I would say here's where Beijing becomes a prisoner of its own words, of its own policies, right? It's hammered home the fact that Taiwan is so important. It's the issue, right? And so they can't back down. And here, remember I mentioned, you know how many countries that Taiwan is formally recognized by as a country? It's about 24, right? And they're all piddly little countries. They're fabulous little places. I've visited some of them, right? But they're pretty small countries. They're relatively insignificant. So why should anyone care about these countries, right? Well, it's about nationalism, whether it's on Taiwan or the mainland. For Taiwan's leaders and Taiwanese people, as I said, they're proud of their accomplishments, and they want to be treated like a citizen of the world, like a member of the global community. And guess who's getting in the way? China. China refuses to allow that. Now, as I said, there are these little countries, right? So why should Beijing care? Why should they care? Who cares if Taiwan has relations with these small countries, mainly in Oceania, Latin America, and Africa, right? But that does matter, precisely because of nationalism, precisely because of nationalism. So this is the most contentious issue. And when Hu Jintao met with the chairman of the Kuomintang, I think, if not the most important, one of the most important concerns that Hu Jintao had was the issue of Taiwan's international activities. And what did he mean by that? This kind of thing. And China and Taiwan's annual, I don't know if they did it this year, but it has become an annual effort, a token, a symbolic effort to try and join the United Nations. Of course they know they can't do that. But their allies in the UN, these micro-states, if you like, and small states, have annually in recent years sponsored what do you sponsor in the UN? You sponsor a motion or a bill to have Taiwan join the UN. Of course it always fails, but it bugs the hell out of China, to use a technical phrase, right? And so here's where nationalism comes in, and it's a very dangerous game.